do you think that it has the ability to change people's brains over time if the use is strong enough?
Yeah, so a lot of the research that I did initially in terms of how I got started looking at cannabis and in particular THC. So when we talk about cannabis from especially from an addiction perspective, we're talking about THC since we know that's a cannabinoid is that is associated with the reward, the high. We can see that repeated use of cannabis and especially high potency cannabis, meaning high concentrations of THC does change the brain, and it changes the brain in different ways. So it can change how the activity of the cells, it can change the structure of the cells, actually the morphology of those cells, and the connectivity of how different our brains were are obviously is never silent, and that connection between different cells and different brain regions, cannabis can impact on that, even not just on the short term, but we see it even long term. And that's where some of my studies looking at like the developmental effects of cannabis, where we study the brains much later after their initial cannabis use.
What have you found on the developmental brain? Like, what has the research suggested as far as like kids who smoke marijuana that has a lot of THC in it? Like, what have you found that happens to their brains like later on in life?
Yeah, so I was saying, one of the reasons I went down this path to start with, a crazy path, was the old adage of like this gateway hypothesis. Like, if you smoke cannabis as a teen, you're going to end up, going to other addictive or hard drugs later on. But I just wanted to know, was there a neurobiological issue aspect to that? Because of course, there were a lot of debates, and there still is. And so using our animal models where we can get, really control all the variables with humans that make it challenging to interpret some of the human data, when we give THC to, say, our rat models as adolescents and then study them later in adults, we could see that they were much more sensitive to opioids, so they would self administer more opioids. They showed greater impairment of decision making, risky behavior, especially if they were re exposed to THC again in adulthood. And we could also compare that in our to human to adults who have a cannabis use disorder and see that there were very similar things in their decision making, their risky behavior, their impulsivity. And so the developmental effects we could, in terms of the adolescent exposure to THC and especially high dose THC, we could see also increase their sensitivity to stress. So, so it's not that animals and people go around looking, quote unquote, for lack of another word, crazy just because they had adolescent exposure to THC. Often it's what happens to them in their lives. So there are changes in the stress responsivity, so that, yes, they're going around normally, but they encounter certain stress, and then they showed much greater impulsivity with that, or risky behavior, changes in their decision making, their reward sensitivity. And we could even see that their stress hormone, the corticosterone or cortisol levels in humans, was much more elevated. We could also see that it impacts on the activity of certain cells in the brain. And so we know that it has a long lasting effect, even if the person, did not use the cannabis again for a long while.
So would you say the main danger of kids who are using high potency or using marijuana that contains a lot of THC, the main danger is that it impacts their ability to manage and deal with stress. And then so later on down the road, they've trained their brain to deal with stress using a substance. And then once more stress happens, once that substance, the novelty or the high kind of wears off, they're now forced to go into something more severe, such as opiates, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a one to one that the person is going to go in and start, using heroin and become addicted to heroin because of that. But you said it perfectly in the context of a lot of our patients with a cannabis use disorder, they will tell us they use it for dealing with their anxiety. But all the data shows that the more they use, the more they exacerbate and they worsen their anxiety disorder, the less they're able to actually deal with stress. So they are inadvertently worsening the damage. And the higher the THC content that they use, the more their brains change in a manner that you can say limit how the buffer that they have to deal with stress, to cope. And then they go back to the drug because then they're like, oh, this had helped, but it helps acutely. And I think people mistake intoxication for anti anxiety, that it's actually not alleviating their anxiety. They're just getting intoxicated. And they're two different things. But I will also say, even in our animal models, there are behavioral traits, personality traits that actually not everybody who gets exposed to THC will develop certain things that we see later on. We're still trying to understand, obviously that individual differences, but in large part, we do see that this greater sensitivity to reward, not being able to buffer stress as much, being much more anxiety sensitive, also, cognition being impacted, especially under those conditions.
Not to play the blame game, but I'm trying. I would love to just try to get your thoughts to help my audience maybe understand, like, you know, who's more at risk for developing cannabis use disorder, who's more at risk for developing some sort of addiction to cannabis that could result in potential psychosis and stuff. Have you found that, based on the data that you've seen, maybe people you've talked to, have you found that the environment will determine whether or not somebody becomes addicted to cannabis, or do you believe it's like the substance, high potency THC in itself?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things, again, most of the data epidemiologically, even in preclinical animal studies, is that the earlier you're exposed, the higher the concentration of THC and the frequency of use, the increased frequency, they do increase your vulnerability. Just like cannabis, for other substances of abuse as well, cannabis is no different, meaning environment does matter. So we do see that individuals that had, traumatic early life events, they're much more vulnerable to later, cannabis use disorder. But you see that, as I said, with other substances. And for me, it pains my heart because, the abuse or the trauma that a lot of children may experience, that gets encoded obviously into cells that then makes them much more vulnerable. And it comes back again to this whole aspect of stress sensitivity. But there are many people who also, experience a similar environment who do not go on to develop a cannabis use disorder, even if they may be exposed to cannabis. But there are other things often in their lives that can buffer some of that. And so, the question for us is, again, the individual differences of why certain individuals may be able to be more resilient, overcome some of those stressors. But the environment definitely plays a really huge is a really huge factor, that together with perhaps aspects of genetics, when we think about people who are, develop psychosis. But even with the psychosis, we see this increased frequency, or incidence now of psychosis, but it's linked a lot to the potency of the THC. So in Europe, they've done, I take Europe more than the US, where US is definitely much more cannabis available. But even in Europe, yes, it's growing, but there you could see and really track that the increased THC potency they showed in, different cities, increased psychosis in young people, even if you may not have quote unquote a genetic risk. So it's this multifactorial complex aspect of the environment, THC potency, and that people are getting exposed to this high potency THC younger. And the younger you are, the greater the vulnerability to develop the cannabis use disorder.
What percentage of marijuana these days that most of these kids is consuming, like, what percent of it is THC based compared to like 20, 30 years ago?
The cannabis today is nothing compared to the cannabis 20, 30, even 10 years ago. I don't I and definitely nothing compared to the original plant. And that's one of the things when people tell me, "Oh, this is organic, it's natural." It has been a plant that has been modified tremendously. So, for example, the THC content in today's cannabis is around, like, depending of I would go for the lowest, like 15 to 24% and higher. The original plant was like 2%. They went to 4%, and just kept on getting higher. But it's not just the flower that's the issue. Now there are many more ways in which people consume cannabis. So, yes, the old days, the bongs and so on. But you have these vapes, you have these shatters, these isolates that can be even 70 to 90% THC. That is not, quote unquote, your grandfather's cannabis. It is not. It's not even your mother's cannabis. And that is the problem. People think that it's the same. And that's why we're seeing greater psychiatric vulnerability in young people than we did before. Because the question is, why didn't you see this before? You see this more, this incidence of greater psychiatric vulnerability, greater addiction vulnerability, because the plant and the products in which people are consuming them has changed dramatically. So they're getting very, very high potent THC in their brain.
What's so alluring to kids about marijuana today, given the fact that you're sharing what you've shared? I've heard other people share similar information that marijuana today isn't the marijuana that it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and it's in fact it's a lot more dangerous than it used to be. But yet, it seems like a lot of these kids have no fear and they're just doing it anyway. Like, why is it so appealing to them?
You know, it's a combination, I think, of so many things. I think, teens, just the nature of teens, if someone tells you this is bad, you're going to go and, want to check it out for yourself. They don't trust, right? And I think that that's, a part of the adolescent brain. But it's also that our society today, we're much more of a drug society. And also the availability, it's everywhere. And social media, every they want to be cool and so on. And they're like, people before said, oh, cannabis would make you, you know crazy, jump out of the building, you commit suicide. And they took it and they didn't do that. And so then they start questioning, like I said, rightly so, the all the people saying, oh, this is horrible. And then some of them get into that trap that in fact they do develop, depression like, anxiety like disorders, psychosis, and so on. But I think teens, by that very nature, and because it's everywhere around them. I live in New York City. I love New York. You walk down certain streets in New York, you get high from just the amount of you know cannabis smoke that's there. And this is a city where everybody frowns on everyone else if they smoke cigarettes. you know so there has been such a, I call this, pendulum shift of cannabis being horrible, you're going to die from the and then now cannabis being said, it can cure all. And I think that this is where in society that it's not so bad. And then the kids, I do think that for teens today and all of us, it's a very stressful time. Teens are going through a lot, and there are not that many outlets for them. And so when you have available a drug and they don't realize how potent it is, and that yes, it's not like their grandmother's cannabis, and then they get trapped into it. So I think many people are just, I know people hate the term self-medicate, but I think that there's definitely high stress for teens, high stress, high accessibility to these, and that combination makes it easier.
So, do you believe, given the high potency of THC in cannabis today, that it deserves to be in the same conversation as far as the addictive nature of it is things like cocaine, heroin, etc.?
About 30% of people who use cannabis in the last year or so will develop a cannabis use disorder, and that's actually similar to the numbers of when you look at who develops a cocaine use disorder or opiate use disorder. It's, before we would say cannabis is not as addictive though as heroin and cocaine, but it's because the number of people using cannabis is so much more than use cocaine and heroin. So that's why you get this higher the number that's equal. I would definitely say that, you know, individuals using these high potency THC, you are getting into that range of much higher addiction vulnerability because there is no way our endogenous our natural cannabinoid receptors, they were never meant to be hit with such a hard hammer. And we know that addiction risk increases as the concentration of the active substance that associated with reward increases. It's well documented. That is not controversial. And it's the controversy is that, yes, there are a lot of cannabis products, so not all of them are the 70, 90%, but the majority of them are way over the 4%. So that is where the issue is. So the addiction risk definitely has increased, which is shocking to me because in the beginning, it wasn't that I thought that cannabis would ever be considered in the same breath as cocaine and opioids in regard to addiction risk. But we have made the products in such a manner that it is getting to a level that we need to consider. And I'm not saying that we should reschedule, you know, cannabis in any way, shape, or form, or again go back to criminalizing and locking people up. 'Cause that's not a way to treat people who have a disorder. But I think people do need to understand they're not taking a benign drug. People want to compare it to alcohol. Alcohol is not great either. But it's like, but it's like so. I don't like to compare. I just like to look at each of them individually in terms of what are some of the health risks and what are some of the health benefits? And as a society, we try to balance those.
So if a parent's listening to this and they've been saying to themselves with their kid who's in high school that's been using marijuana, well, at least they're not drinking. You should say that they need to change the way they look at that situation, right?